Story 1. A note from a neighbor. My neighbor's house had always been a quiet, unremarkable place. The kind you hardly noticed unless something odd happened. Mr. Beverly, the man who lived there, was just as unassuming. A solitary figure who rarely spoke or ventured out. We'd exchange polite nods now and then, but nothing more. I didn't even know if he had family or friends. One night, though, everything changed. I woke up to the sound of loud banging, followed by scraping noises. It sounded like someone was moving furniture or dragging something heavy. The noise came from Beverly's house, just across the narrow alley that separated our homes. It was 1:30 in the morning, and the racket didn't let up for at least an hour. I considered going over to check, but I'd convinced myself it wasn't worth the trouble. Maybe he was redecorating. Strange, sure, but not my business. The next day, his house was quiet. The blinds were drawn, and his car was gone. A couple of days later, Mrs. Haggerty, the neighborhood busybody, informed me he'd moved out. "Didn't even say goodbye," she huffed, clutching her poodle. "Odd man, that Beverly. Always was." I nodded, but her words stuck with me. I hadn't seen any moving trucks or signs of a proper move. Just silence after that one chaotic night. A week passed before I noticed the note. It was on Beverly's windowsill, visible from the street. I wouldn't have seen it if the sunlight hadn't caught the edge just right. At first I thought it might have been left by the landlord or someone renting the place, but as I got closer, my stomach dropped. My name was written on the envelope. That wasn't just curiosity that made me reach for it. It was unease. The glass on the window was cracked, making it easy to slip my fingers inside and grab the envelope. I unfolded the paper, my heart pounding harder with every crease. Double creases casting the letters into a blur for the first time. It was a hand-drawn map of my house. Every room was outlined, right down to the furniture placement. But what stopped me cold was the bold red ink marking the attic. Beside it, scrawled in shaky handwriting, were 2 words: "I'm here." That night, I locked every door and window in the house, twice. The map lay on my kitchen table, its lines etched into my memory. The red circle over the attic felt like a target, a silent accusation. You're being watched. I didn't go up to check. I couldn't. The attic had always been a forgotten part of the house, used for storage and little else. The idea of opening that creaky trapdoor now made my skin crawl. At first I tried to convince myself the note was some sick joke. Maybe Beverly was a prankster after all. But why me? We weren't friends. We barely even spoke. As the hours dragged on, those questions began to lose their meaning. It didn't matter why. The real question was, what do I do now? Around midnight, I finally managed to drift off on the couch, the map still on the table beside me. That was when the footsteps started. Oh, man. At first, I thought it was the house settling. Old wood and drafts could make all kinds of noises. But then I heard it again. Slow, deliberate creaks, like someone walking directly above me. My blood ran cold. The attic. I sat up, straining to listen. The sound came again, heavier this time. A pause, then another creak. The steps were moving, closer to the attic door. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, but my thumb hovered over the call button. What would I even say? I think there's someone in my attic because my reclusive neighbor left me a creepy note before disappearing? It sounded insane. Instead, I grabbed the nearest thing I could use as a weapon, a fireplace poker, and stood under the attic hatch. My heart was pounding so loudly I thought it might drown out the footsteps above. For a long moment, There was silence. My voice swelled with pain, and I shouted that I couldn't pay now. And then the hatch shifted. Just slightly, as if someone was testing it from the other side. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I bolted to the backyard, stumbling over the garden hose as I fumbled to unlock the gate. Once I was outside, I turned to look at the house. The attic window was dark, but I could swear I saw something. A shadow, maybe, move behind the glass. The jaded cow mansion of my youth was revealed to me by its strangely bright merino and the sunny front. I stayed outside until dawn, clutching the poker like a lifeline. When the sun finally rose, I worked up the courage to go back inside. Everything was silent again, but the dread didn't leave me. I called the police, this time for real, and told them I'd heard noises in my attic during the night. 2 officers came by that afternoon. They were polite but skeptical, probably chalking me up as a paranoid homeowner. Still, they went up to check. I stayed at the bottom of the ladder, gripping the banister so hard my knuckles turned white. "There's nothing up here," one of them called down after a few minutes. "Just a lot of dust and old boxes." I didn't feel relief. I felt dread. Because that meant whoever, or whatever, had been up there was gone. But then, just as they were leaving, one of the officers stopped. He knelt down, squinting at the floorboards near the attic window. "Hey," he said, waving his partner over. "Look at this." I climbed up just far enough to see what he was pointing at. My stomach turned. A set of footprints, clear as day, etched into the dust-covered floorboards. The prints were fresh, and they were leading straight to the hatch. The officers left soon after finding the footprints. "We'll keep an eye on things," one of them assured me, though the look in his eyes said, "You're on your own." They suggested I install cameras or call them if I heard anything else. If? I wanted to scream. There was no if. Whoever had been in my attic had walked right above me as I slept. I spent the rest of the day in a fog, jumping at every creak and shadow. The idea of staying in the house another night made my skin crawl, but I didn't have anywhere else to go. Hotels were out of my budget, and I couldn't admit to anyone I knew that I was too scared to sleep in my own home. By the time darkness fell, I felt like a prisoner in my own space. I barricaded the attic hatch with a chair wedged tightly under the handle and dragged my mattress into the living room. The thought of sleeping directly under the attic was unbearable. The first few hours were silent, too silent. Every little sound, the ticking of the clock, the hum of the refrigerator, seemed deafening. I tried watching TV to distract myself, but I couldn't focus. My mind kept drifting back to the footprints, the note, the hatch shifting ever so slightly. And then, just past 2 a.m., the noises started again. At first it was faint, a soft thump, like something being dropped. Then came the creak of floorboards, slow and deliberate. My heart pounded in my chest as the sounds grew louder, more deliberate. This wasn't the house settling. It wasn't the wind. Someone was walking up there. I gripped the fireplace poker, sweat slicking my palms. The barricaded hatch didn't make me feel any safer. If anything, it made the situation worse. If whoever was up there wanted to come down, they'd just have to push a little harder. The giant screamed. The creaking stopped, and for a moment I dared to hope that maybe it was over. But then came a sound that froze me in place. A long, drawn-out scraping, as if something heavy was being dragged across the attic floor. It stopped, then started again. Each scrape slower than the last. And then I heard it. A voice. At first I thought I was imagining it. It was faint, barely audible over the pounding of my own heartbeat. But as I strained to listen, I realized it wasn't just noise. Someone, or something, was whispering. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was low, guttural, and wrong in a way I couldn't describe. I wanted to run. My body screamed at me to get out of the house, to put as much distance as possible between myself and whatever was up there. But I couldn't move. My legs felt like lead, rooted to the floor as the whispering grew louder. And then it stopped. The silence was somehow worse. I held my breath, waiting for the next sound, the next movement. But instead there was nothing. No footsteps, no scraping, no whispering. Just the deafening silence of a house holding its breath. I don't know how long I sat there, clutching the poker and staring at the hatch. Minutes, hours, time lost all meaning. All I knew was that the chair wedged under the hatch hadn't moved, and I was still alive. When the first light of dawn broke through the windows, I forced myself to stand. My muscles ached from the tension, and my throat was dry from breathing shallowly all night. I decided then and there that I couldn't stay in the house another night. But as I turned to gather my things, something caught my eye. The map, the one Mr. Beverly had left for me, was still on the kitchen table. But it wasn't the same. Looking to my left, I saw an expansive clearing. It was too wide for a car, too curvy for a building, and more than that, too small. A new mark had been added in fresh red ink. This time the circle wasn't over the attic. It was over my bedroom. It was called a show. The realization hit me like a punch to the chest. My bedroom. The red circle was there, bold and unmistakable. My hands trembled as I stared at the map, trying to process what it meant. Someone had been in my house while I was downstairs. They'd updated the map, and they'd done it quietly enough that I hadn't heard a thing. My mind raced through the possibilities, each more horrifying than the last. The sun had risen, but the pale morning light did little to ease the oppressive sense of dread. The walls of my house felt like they were closing in, suffocating me. I couldn't stay here anymore. I wouldn't. I grabbed my car keys and bolted for the door, leaving everything behind. But the moment I stepped outside, I froze. The attic window was open. It hadn't been before. The sight of it stopped me in my tracks, dread pooling in my stomach. The window wasn't just open. It was wide enough for someone to climb through. My grip on the car keys tightened, and for a split second I considered just getting in the car and driving away. But then I saw the figure. It was standing in the shadow of the attic window, half concealed by the dim light. At first I thought it was a trick of my imagination, but then it moved. A slow, deliberate shift that made my breath catch in my throat. It wasn't Mr. Beverly. The figure was too tall, its proportions all wrong. The way it moved was unnatural, jerky, like a puppet being yanked by invisible strings. And then it turned, just enough for the light to catch its face. There wasn't one. The face was smooth, featureless, like a mannequin left half-finished. Where eyes and a mouth should have been, there was nothing but blankness. But even without features, I felt its gaze, cold and heavy, pressing down on me like a weight. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the porch steps. My instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. The figure tilted its head, as if studying me, and then it moved. It didn't climb out of the attic window. It didn't walk down the stairs. It didn't move like anything human. One moment it was in the window, and the next it was on the ground, standing perfectly still just a few feet away from me. My vision tunneled as panic set in. I scrambled to get the car door open, but my hands were shaking too badly to grip the handle. The figure stepped closer, slow and deliberate. It didn't make a sound, not even the crunch of gravel underfoot. And then it spoke, not with a voice, but with a sound that filled my head, rattling my skull like static. "You shouldn't have looked." The words were garbled, warped, as if they were coming from a broken radio. I don't remember how I got into the car. My memory is a blur of panic and adrenaline. All I know is that I turned the key and slammed the accelerator, my tires screeching as I sped down the street. My house, my neighborhood, the figure, they all blurred into the rearview mirror as I drove. Faster than I'd ever driven in my life. I didn't stop until I was miles away, parked in a gas station with the engine still running. My chest heaved as I tried to catch my breath, my mind racing to make sense of what had just happened. I heard noises in the background, like children playing. But then I noticed something. The map. It was sitting on the passenger seat, even though I was certain I'd left it in the house. My hands trembled as I picked it up, and my stomach dropped. A new circle had been added. This time it wasn't over my house. It was over the gas station. And beneath it, in that same shaky handwriting, voices behind the wall. "I'm here." I'd barely finished unpacking when I noticed the first oddity. The apartment was everything I'd hoped for. Spacious, affordable, and located in the heart of the city. It was the kind of deal you don't question too hard, especially when you're desperate for a fresh start. But that first night, as I lay in bed staring at the cracked ceiling, I heard it. A faint, muffled conversation coming from the other side of the bedroom wall. End of chapter 57. At first it was easy to dismiss. Old buildings have thin walls, and neighbors tend to forget how sound carries. But as I lay there, listening, something about the voices unsettled me. They weren't loud enough for me to make out the words, but the tone was sharp, tense, like an argument. And yet, there was no rhythm to it, no pauses, no back and forth, just a constant stream of murmurs that seemed to bleed into one another. By the time I drifted off to sleep, the voices were still there, echoing faintly in my mind. 10 minutes later, I was awakened again, still drowsy. The next morning, I decided to investigate. The building manager had been quick to assure me that the neighboring unit was vacant, but maybe someone had moved in recently without his knowledge. I knocked on the door next to mine, the sound echoing down the dimly lit hallway. No answer. I knocked again, harder this time. Still nothing. Frowning, I leaned closer, pressing my ear to the door. The wood felt cold against my skin, and for a moment I thought I heard something. A faint shuffling, like fabric brushing against the floor, but it could have been my imagination. By the third night, the voices had become impossible to ignore. They started at midnight, low and indistinct, growing louder as the hours crept by. I tried knocking on the wall, hoping whoever was on the other side would get the hint. The voices stopped immediately, and for a brief, blissful moment, I thought it had worked. I looked, but then they started again, louder than before. The next morning, I called the building manager. "Hey," I said, trying to keep my tone casual. "Is someone living next door to me, apartment 302? There was a pause on the other end of the line. 302? The manager repeated, his voice tinged with confusion. "No, that unit's been vacant for years." My stomach tightened. "Are you sure? Because I've been hearing voices, like someone's talking through the wall." The line crackled faintly, and when the manager spoke again, his tone was uneasy. "That apartment's been empty since 2003. No one's lived there since the accident." "Accident?" I pressed. He hesitated. "It's an old building," he said finally, his voice tight. "Strange things happen sometimes. Maybe it's the pipes. I hung up feeling more unsettled than ever. That night the voices returned, louder and clearer than before. This time I could make out snippets of words, fragments of sentences that sent chills down my spine. Brings the tears to his eyes. We're waiting. You'll see soon enough. I couldn't take it anymore. Grabbing my phone, I opened the recording app and pressed the microphone against the wall. If I could catch the sounds on tape, I'd have proof. Proof I wasn't imagining things. Proof that someone was in that apartment. I recorded for a full minute, my hand trembling slightly. When the voices faded, I stopped the recording and hit play. At first, all I heard was static. Then came the whisper. Your name. My name, repeated over and over, soft and deliberate, like a chant. My breath caught as the whisper grew louder, more insistent, until it was the only thing I could hear. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. I looked up, and that's when I saw it. The door to apartment 302 was ajar. The door to apartment 302 had never moved before. It was always closed, as solid and lifeless as the peeling paint on its surface. But now, it stood slightly open, just enough for a sliver of darkness to peek through. I stared at it, my pulse pounding in my ears. It felt like the entire hallway was holding its breath, waiting for me to do something. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. No response. The air felt heavier, colder, like the temperature had dropped several degrees. I took a hesitant step forward, the creak of the floorboards unnaturally loud in the stillness. As I got closer, I noticed something strange about the darkness beyond the door. It wasn't just the absence of light. It was deeper, thicker, like a void that swallowed everything. I stopped just short of the doorway, my heart hammering against my ribs. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to go back to my apartment and lock the door. But I couldn't. Something was pulling me forward, a curiosity, a compulsion I couldn't explain. I raised a hand, pushing the door open just enough to peer inside. The apartment was empty, or at least it should have been. The room was bare, the floors dusty, the walls cracked with age, but the space felt wrong. The shadows were too long, too sharp, stretching across the room in impossible angles. And the air hummed, a low vibration that seemed to crawl under my skin and settle in my bones. And then I saw it. On the floor, in the center of the room, was a chair, a single wooden chair facing the wall. It was empty. Couldn't look away. The chair sat perfectly still, untouched by the faint draft that stirred the dust around it. But there was something about it, something oppressive, like it didn't belong in this world. I took a step closer, my breath fogging in the icy air. The hum in the room grew louder, more insistent, vibrating through the soles of my feet. And then I noticed the wall behind the chair. Words were scrawled across it, carved deep into the plaster. At first, I couldn't make them out, but as I stepped closer, the message became clear. "Do not sit." He said. My stomach churned as I read the words again and again. Who had written them? And why? Homa. The voices started again, faint and indistinct, coming from every direction. They weren't behind the walls anymore. They were in the room with me. "He's here. He's seen it. It's too late." I stumbled back, my hands shaking. My foot caught on something, and I nearly tripped. Looking down, I saw a trail of footprints leading to the chair. Bare, human footprints, etched in the dust. They weren't mine. I turned to leave, but as I stepped into the hallway, I froze. The door to my own apartment was open. My front door should have been locked. I remembered locking it before I left, turning the key with that satisfying click. And yet, now it stood wide open, the darkness inside seeming to stretch and spill into the hallway. For a moment I stood frozen, torn between the urge to run and the compulsion to step inside. The whispers from apartment 302 still echoed faintly behind me, a distorted murmur that seemed to follow me down the hall. But something was in my apartment now. I could feel it. I took a cautious step forward, my palms slick with sweat. As I crossed the threshold, the air inside felt different. Stale, heavy, carrying a faint metallic tang that made my stomach turn. My mind went to the conference room in the hotel with its peculiar darkness and its very high ceiling. The living room was exactly as I'd left it, the couch slightly askew, a mug on the coffee table, and my phone lying face down on the armrest. But the shadows seemed darker now, deeper, like they were watching me. "Is someone here?" I called out, my voice trembling. Silence. I moved toward the hallway, each step feeling heavier than the last. My bedroom door was ajar, a thin sliver of light spilling out onto the floor. That's when I heard it, a faint creak, like the sound of weight shifting on a wooden floorboard. I stopped, my heart hammering in my chest. The noise came again, clearer this time, and I realized it wasn't coming from my bedroom. It was coming from behind me. I turned slowly, my breath catching in my throat. The door to my apartment, the one I'd just walked through, was now closed. My pulse quickened as I backed away, my eyes scanning the room. Nothing seemed out of place, but the air felt colder now, pressing against my skin like icy fingers. A few seconds later, I heard the doors crack and open a little. The woman crossed over, picked up Brody's purse, and then I noticed the photograph. It was lying on the coffee table, though I was certain it hadn't been there before. My legs trembled as I picked it up, my fingers brushing against the glossy surface. "Haven't you ever?" I begged, in my most desperate moments. The image was dark and grainy, but I recognized the scene immediately. It was my apartment. In the photo, I was standing in the living room, staring at the camera with wide, terrified eyes, but I hadn't taken this photo. Someone else had. A faint sound broke the silence, a low, guttural whisper, too close to my ear. "Look closer, maybe it's for me." I spun around, the photograph falling from my hands. The room was empty, but the shadows seemed to shift, coiling and twisting along the walls like living things. The hum from apartment 302 returned, louder now, vibrating through the floor. I could feel it in my chest, in my teeth, like a distant storm drawing closer. Near and nearer, I thought, until the sound was all but in sight myself. And then I saw it. The door to apartment 302 wasn't ajar anymore. It was wide open. The open door of apartment 302 loomed at the end of the hallway, its darkness seeming to pulse, alive with something unseen. The hum grew louder, more insistent, vibrating through the floorboards and into my chest. I didn't want to go inside. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to leave the building and never come back. But I couldn't. It kept me attached to my employer. Something was pulling me forward. I crossed the threshold, my steps hesitant and uneven. The shadows inside the apartment seemed thicker now, swallowing the weak light that trickled in from the hallway. The chair in the center of the room was still there, facing the wall. But now, something else was with it. Footprints, though they were fresh, trailing through the dust in a looping, erratic pattern. They led from the doorway to the chair, then back to the corner, then around the walls, as though someone had been pacing. The sergeant, "Who's there?" I called, my voice barely above a whisper. "There is—" The whom stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. It pressed against me, heavy and suffocating, making it hard to breathe. And then, from the far corner of the room, came the sound of footsteps. "Where?" said he. They were slow, deliberate, the floorboards groaning under the weight of something I couldn't see. My chest tightened as the footsteps grew closer, circling the chair. The shadows shifted, pulling back like a curtain to reveal the figure standing there. It was me, or at least, it looked like me. The figure was identical in every way, same face, same clothes, even the same terrified expression. But its eyes were wrong. They were black pits, empty and endless, and they stared at me with a malice that felt like a physical weight. "You shouldn't have come here," it said, its voice distorted, layered with something inhuman. My breath caught as the figure stepped closer, its movements jerky and unnatural. "You don't belong here," it hissed, its voice echoing in my ears. "But now you can't leave." With shock, the pieces of my world started to fall into place, fragments of truth falling to the floor. The chair behind it creaked, the sound sharp and jarring. I glanced at it instinctively, and my stomach churned. Our father carried us. Someone, or something, was sitting in it now. Its face was hidden in the shadows, but I could feel its gaze, cold and unrelenting. The air around it seemed to warp, pulling everything toward it like a black hole. The figure that looked like me stepped aside, gesturing toward the chair with a twisted smile. "It's waiting for you," it said. Gabed smiled. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "You don't have a choice," it replied. The shadows surged forward, wrapping around my legs, my arms, pulling me toward the chair. I screamed, thrashing against their grip, but it was no use. The darkness was too strong, too cold, sapping the strength from my body. The last thing I saw before the shadows consumed me completely was the figure sitting in the chair. "Statistics are a lie." It leaned forward, its face finally emerging from the darkness. It was mine, and it was smiling. The building manager found the apartment empty the next day. Apartment 302 was locked, the dust undisturbed. But my apartment was another story. The furniture was gone, the walls stripped bare. The only thing left was a single photograph lying on the floor. It showed apartment 302. In the center of the room was a chair, and sitting in the chair, barely visible in the shadows, was me.